Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome up. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our debut episode of our new economics podcast, Keeping Up with the Keynesians, where we explore all topics, economics, current affairs, you name it. Today I'm joined by the lovely Elliot Guy and James Hilton.
Hi Ollie.
Hi Oliver.
First of all, what do you think of the name?
I think it's a great name, and I can't wait to start unpacking what it really means.
Links to Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which me and Guy here watch all the time.
So, given the name, I think it would be fitting if our first episode is about the big man himself, John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes, do you want to introduce him to us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, John Maynard Keynes was born in 1883, and he was an economist who studied at Cambridge University. When he was at Cambridge, he read mathematics and economics, and after that, he trained in classical economics. However, he wasn't what you'd call your typical economist. When he was training in classical economics, he rejected the idea that markets fix themselves, and he came up with his own brand of economics. This is known as Keynesianism. Actually, do you want to start a little bit? He wrote in 1936 The General Theory of Employment, Interests and Money, which laid out his vision of how economics actually worked. And in today's episode, we're going to unpack what his vision was.
Brilliant. James, are you able to explain what did he believe?
You see, his key idea that aligned with previous economists such as Adam Smith was that the government should intervene when demand is low. As during recessions, people and businesses stopped spending, which created a downward spiral that led to less spending, fewer jobs, and therefore even less spending. He came up with his very own solution in which governments should spend more money to stimulate the economy. This nowadays is known as fiscal demand, and even if the government were going into more debt, once the economy recovered, the government could then cut back on their government spending and increase taxation to repay their debts. This was known as his counter-cyclical policy. For example, let's imagine you're in a traffic jam. The classical economists say, no, let's just wait and it will clear itself up. But Keynesian said, no, let's build another lane, and that will allow the traffic to move faster.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. I mean, that sounds great in theory, but does it actually work in the real world? I mean, if you look at real world examples, if you take the Great Depression, for example, before Keynes was around, governments responded to economic downturns by cutting spending in the hope of rebuilding debt, and hopefully that would amend itself. In Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s, public works projects, infrastructure and job programs, they were all influenced by Keynesian thinking, and often they worked. For example, the Hoover Dam project stimulated a great deal of demand and helped the American economy recover. Also, if you look at World War II, although it was an horrific event and there was a lot of social decline, economically it was very beneficial on the whole, with a lot of government intervention with World War II spending, ultimately ended the Great Depression by triggering that extra demand that was needed. I think that this example of these infrastructure projects was key in establishing that government intervention may sometimes be necessary in recovering economies. James, you want to look at the 2008 financial crisis?
In your economics classes, you probably heard about the 2008 financial crisis, but not everyone knows how this does link to Keynes' ideas. See, in 2008, there was a huge drop in demand and rising unemployment due to the global recession. The housing market had completely collapsed, banks were failing, and the economy had gone into freefall, with consumer confidence plummeting and businesses stopping hiring. With a US $787 billion stimulus package through the Obama administration, Keynesian ideas came into play. The government began pouring money in to try and help the economy recover. Although this led to rising government debt, it prevented the total collapse of the American economy. Critics argue that it created a bailout culture in which the government's rescuing falling businesses instead of letting the market work itself out.
Thank you very much, James, and Ollie as well. However, this is all well and good, but a number of our listeners today weren't even alive in 2008, and certainly not before then. So, a slightly more recent example of the benefits of John Maynard Keynes' branch of thinking in the modern world is in 2019. Because as everybody knows, we went into a great lockdown, and this brought the working world to a standstill. People couldn't work, they got furloughed, they had no options. If they couldn't work from home, factory workers, for example, had no options. So, governments were forced to intervene. And in 2019, trillions have been spent worldwide on stimulus checks, on furlough schemes, on business grants, all trying to promote economic growth and prevent the economy from collapsing. in a difficult time when a number of people weren't able to work. And a number of economists nowadays say that Keynes's theories and Keynesianism saved the Western world during COVID-19, because without that government intervention, then we wouldn't have been able to bounce back. So this is a big example of Keynesian almost in a huge perspective, like Keynesianism on steroids, you could almost say. Finally, others may argue the overheated economy, because we know the UK has had problems with high inflation rates in recent times. However, that's evidently dying down. So on the whole, you could see the positive benefits Keynesianism has had in the COVID-19 pandemic.
Brilliant. Thank you, Elliot. I mean, the real debate is Keynesian economics still the answer in the modern day world? So in my opinion, I mean, government intervention has proven in the past and still has to prevent economic disasters. I think that although free market economists may argue that no government intervention and letting the market heal itself is the way to go, I still think that an element of government intervention is key for maintaining stability. I mean, without Keynesian stimulus, 2008 and COVID-19 would have been much worse, and we may not have even recovered by this time.
I mean, I see your point, absolutely. However, you do have to think of it from the other perspective. It is evident that John Maynard Keynes argued government should input money when times are difficult in the economy, but he never argued that when times were going well, government should keep flooding money into the economy because it can lead to inflation. So definitely, if John Maynard Keynes were alive today, he might say governments need to listen to what he was saying and cut back when times are good in order to allow the government to pay back their own debt. Because if you look at national debts nowadays of developed countries, they're skyrocketing. Additionally, there are alternative economic views such as Milton Friedman's, and he believed that inflation is caused by putting too much money in circulation, and it's not by a lack of demand. And obviously, when times are going well and the government keeps putting in loads of money into circulation, inflation can skyrocket and lead to hyperinflation. And additionally, another Austrian economist known as Hayek believed that government intervention distorts markets and creates artificial bubbles, which I believe is certainly a valid standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I see that point really, and I do sympathise with it. But then you could see that government intervention in a country like China, which has a strong government hold on the economy, they're extremely successful, where state investment drives a lot of their economic growth, and you can see that one of the biggest growing economies in the world.
Absolutely. However, obviously, we know China has strong communist influence, and with communism, does it work the same?
I guess so. Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, James, would Keynes approve of today's policies?
Keynes definitely believed in a balanced intervention, and it comes back to this idea nowadays of expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy, in which government would spend in bad times where demand is low. So they would drive money into the economy in order to increase supply and demand, whilst they would save in good times to reduce the debt that they have picked up during these bad times. My question to Ollie and Elliot here is, if Keynes were really alive today, what advice would he be giving to governments of the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think obviously it's very dependent on the context, and I think Elliot's point about does it work different with communism and capitalism is a really good one.
Yeah, definitely, because obviously if you have a free market society, then everybody's pushed in order to maximise their own personal gain. Yeah. With communism, everyone's supposed to be held equal, so it works different in terms of economic outputs.
Brilliant. Anyway, thank you very much to both of you. We're now going to go on a little side quest. I've got a little task signed up for both of you. I've got two scenarios here, and I want you to see what you would do if you were John Maynard Keynes in these situations. Does that sound good?
That's great.
Brilliant. So, scenario number one. The panic of 1873, aka the Long Depression. So basically, at this time, there were massive bank failures, businesses collapsing, unemployment surging, but governments did almost nothing. What would you do, James?
Well, as a believer in the Keynesian theory myself, I believe that they should have definitely intervened. The government should have spent money to get them out of this long depression, in which they should have increased the amount of public works and job creation, as well as reduction in tax, which would have increased consumption and hopefully stimulated the economy to get back on track.
Brilliant. Elliot, what would you do?
See, James, that is interesting. However, I feel like if the government continued to put money into the economy, then this would just make the debt crisis worse. Because if they're constantly giving money, they're going to get themselves into debt as well. And this is clearly one of the cornerstones of this long depression, with the bank failures, people weren't able to pay back banks, and it just leaves the economy in such a difficult state. And is the answer to that putting the government in more debt?
Yeah, interesting. Both very good answers. I mean, scenario number 2, we've got the 1929 stock market crash, also determined to be the cause of the Great Depression. So this was before Keynes' general theory. And basically after the crash, governments tightened their belts, raising interest rates and cutting spending. But what would you do, James?
Well, that sounds pretty disastrous. I believe that Keynes would have said... I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I believe Keynes would have been thinking on the lines of borrowing more, government spending more, getting people back on track, whether this is a public work schemes or again, cutting taxes to increase demand.
Brilliant. Elliot?
I mean, that's interesting. Personally, I do agree with you. However, you've always got to think about the other options. Putting loads of money into the economy via the government would clearly have a strong chance of leading to high inflation rates and almost stagflation like it did in the 70s.
So stagflation basically for our viewers.
Hang on, what the hell is stagflation?
Like stagflation just sounds like...
Hang on, just...
Yeah, you're searching up as well.
Is a combination of slow economic growth and high inflation, which ultimately is the worst economic scenario because it's the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, so with that market crash in America, stagflation would have been the worst possible option. Don't you think, James?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So putting more money into the economy might not be the right answer.
100%. I mean, thank you very much for both of you. I thought that was a successful quest.
That was so successful.
So, let's move on to our key takeaways. So, Elliot, what did you learn from today?
So, I'd say Keynes has changed the way we think about economics. I mean, before his time, before he was studying at Cambridge and then went on to study economics, everybody thought quite like-mindedly. I mean, obviously people can have their own opinions, but he really turned a page in what people viewed as the right option to do when you have economic downturn and upturn. Because he realised you should have intervention from the government, and as we can see in modern society, governments in a number of developed countries intervene when you have economic downturn, and you can see the benefits, like we spoke about in COVID-19, in 2008. Without that, where would we be now? And finally...
They go yapping more again.
Finally...
Finish on the good note.
Finally, there is possibly an argument to say that modern governments might have taken it too far, because one key cornerstone of Keynes's book, which he wrote in 1936, was when you have positive periods of economic growth, you need to cut back on spending in order to allow the government to repay their debt.
I mean, yeah, that summarises it quite well. Thank you, Elliot. I mean, Keynes was obviously a very influential person, very important in the history of economics, and I think that some of his ideas have really shaped the way that many policymakers nowadays deal with these crises. And I think that he's just a great person to name our podcast after.
Absolutely, it definitely gives a catchy name, doesn't it?
Thank you, Elliot. I mean, thank you very much for listening, everyone. I'll leave you with a question to finish. Do you think Keynesian still works, or is he outdated? Please let us know, get your thoughts in the comments, DM us if you feel like sharing your thoughts. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to Elliot and James.
Thank you very much, Oliver.
Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.
Oh, I've got good.
She'll say thank you again.